Hello and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with Nurole, the business-oriented podcast that brings the boardroom to your channel of your choice. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Nurole, the board-level hiring platform that specializes in the high-value chair, independent director, advisory board member, and trustee placements that drive high-impact boards. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Richard Nourse to the show. Richard is the founder and managing partner of Greencoat Capital. Greencoat is one of Europe's largest renewables investment managers with over £7 billion under management in wind, solar, bioenergy and more across the UK, Europe and US, providing secure income for their clients whilst accelerating the transition to a low-carbon future. In 2022, Schroders plc acquired a 75% shareholding in Greencoat for an initial consideration of £358 million. Before founding Greencoat in 2009, Richard had a long career in the city, latterly at Merrill Lynch, where he led the EMEA Energy and Power team, and before that at Grenfell. He's also worked for Her Majesty's Government's shareholder executive and acted as a commercial representative for the government's 2017 Cost of Energy Review. Richard has previously served as a non-executive director at Renewable, a supplier of safe uranium enrichment services and fuel cycle products for the nuclear industry. And his Twitter handle describes himself as a recovering banker, type 1 father, and the keeper of a herd of rare breed cattle. Richard, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Richard, I'd love to start with your journey. It's an amazing story going from banking into setting up your own incredibly successful business. Can you talk me through the golden threads that have got you to where you are today?
I often get reminded when I bump into Crispin Wright, who's you may know is still at Rothschild, about how I got hired by Grenfell out of university, which was that I had to wait all day. So I was due to be interviewed at 11 and I eventually got interviewed at 5. And I then listened to someone talk to me for 20 minutes. And then somebody came panting into the room, handed him a note, and he left, and taking Crispin with him. And I got hired. And apparently the conversation outside the room went along the lines of, well, I thought that went rather well. I think we should hire him. And I literally said, hello. And that was it. So perhaps I should think, despite the fact that I'm a person that talks a lot, that less is more. And that part of, I suppose, these things is you just need to be lucky. And I hope that you're in the right place at the right time when good things happen. So I don't really know what to say beyond that, but each sort of time I've taken a step in my career, it's kind of not been something that I've spent years planning. It's been something that's kind of happened. So whether it be the move from being at Grenfell, which at the time I joined it was an exciting, dynamic, albeit old-fashioned, but dynamic organization, going to Merrill Lynch again, which a lot of the Grenfell team had gone to, leaving Merrill Lynch, shareholder executive, and then setting up Greencoat, and then reinventing Greencoat as part of the success of Greencoat. What we did first at Greencoat was a failure. The best thing was that we had the vision to see a way to the success that we've since had.
Fascinating. Tell me more about the initial failure and how you overcame that.
When I left Merrill Lynch was share price riding high, sort of long before the financial crisis had kind of emerged. I guess I was heading towards the point where I was thinking about sort of doing some non-executive roles and trying to find something to occupy myself sort of a third of the time. And I then got to the point where I nearly joined another private equity firm, but didn't. So one of the ones I'd advised when I was a banker. And for various reasons, that then got me sort of set on the idea that private equity probably was an interesting thing to be doing, albeit that I had some advisory expertise, but I didn't have any of the other skills that one needed to do to be in private equity. And then 2008 came, the financial crisis got worse, and I still felt that private equity was the right way forward, but I still, it was more intense, the issues, rather than anything else. And ultimately, I had lunch with a friend of mine who said to me, just don't be stupid. I'm a private equity lawyer who at the moment is helping people get out of the commitments they've made to private equity funds, not to put more money into people who don't really have the skills, who have the hubris that you do after your well-developed career in investment banking. And so, forget it. I thought, okay, that's good. And, I paid for lunch and, thought to myself, well, wonder where that takes us. Then it occurred to me that we're kind of heading into 2008, Tony Blair and the other European leaders were sitting down with the 2020 targets. And it seemed to me that this sort of thing that we sort of known was sort of there or thereabouts, the sort of transition to net zero. We didn't know it was net zero then. We thought it was an 80-90% reduction, was coming on us. And that my old friends utilities, and I knew a lot of the European utilities, would have a series of challenges, one as technology changed, but two as business models changed, that they as utilities probably wouldn't be best placed to survive. And indeed, that has been the case. If you look at the amount of value that European utilities have lost over that decade, It's absolutely huge as other people have come to eat their lunch and the old truths are no longer truths, and the level of change has been enormous. And so I spoke to 3 different utilities, 2 large continental European ones, and then also an Irish one, ESB. And ESB was kind enough to set up essentially a private equity fund, which they contributed people to. And I developed a team around those people, plus myself, plus others. And we started investing a 200 million euro fund in essentially small companies, which we hoped would become big companies, but resolutely remain small. I think we got to the point where probably by 2010-11, it was becoming clear that it was tough in what we were doing, that the speed of change was very slow, the financial crisis had continued rumbling along, and that the adoption rate of renewables was there, but it wasn't fast enough for the companies sort of supplying the picks and shovels to really succeed. And so Bertrand Gauthier, my partner, and I came up with the thought that we needed to think about something else to do. Was it doing more of the same, or was it trying to move into a similar but different part of the market? And we saw that the folks at Climate Change Capital, who had been our big competitors, or to say they were competitors was probably over-egging our position. They were the market leaders, tried and failed to raise a listed fund. And from that, they failed, thank goodness. I rang the team up and said, hey, really interesting what you've done. Wonder whether you'd like to come and do it with us. And they weren't so sure was the truth. But by early 2012, we're now at that, they joined, and they effectively launched their fund in March 2013. And from that, it's now right on the edge of the FTSE, and all of our infrastructure businesses have thrived, and we've grown away from what they've done, or building on the baseline of what was done, to what we are today. And that private equity business that we started after 10 years, we gave it back to ESB and kind of have moved on.
Fascinating. So do you think, looking back, you could have shortcut the process anymore, or was that just an inevitable part of the journey?
No, I think everything has its time. So if you look at the sort of renewable space, in the period up until when we listed in 2013, I think there have only been 4 renewable energy infrastructure transactions in the UK. And I think in an average year now, there are 40 wind farms that get bought and sold. There was no solar back in 2007-8. It just didn't exist. It was on spacecraft and satellites and things like that. And if we were going to decarbonising at essentially £400 an hour was effectively going to be immoral, because people wouldn't be able to afford it. So as we've moved our business forward, things that we sort of thought were going to be successful at the beginning. So biomass, I think we really were excited about. Biomass has not really changed its characteristics over the period since 2008 to where we are today. Clearly, there's a possibility of carbon capture storage for ones like drags, and possibly in the future for others. But the change in particularly the wind and very much the solar sector have been the most intense, with the reduction in the levelized cost of wind from £150 an hour to today's £40-50 an hour, and the levelized cost of solar dropping from 400 to probably less than wind. And globally, solar will be the great winner, and much of the populations around the world are in areas where it's intensely sunny, that will lend themselves to a renewable energy supplied principally by solar with use of batteries and some backup, whereas in sort of darker, chillier northern climes, we'll probably see a bit more wind. Less solar in Finland, more wind. Albeit I believe there is now a Finnish solar farm under construction.
Let's hope for everyone. I want to just sort of understand the role that boards have played through that journey for you, because you've now got a fascinating perspective, having been a banker, a member of a board, and also now a sort of successful founder where a number of the listed entities that the company operates have their own independent boards. What's been your experience of boards? You didn't have a board yourself at Greencoat. How do you think about that? How's your thinking on boards evolved?
I suppose my initial experience of boards is really showing up to boards to provide some support to the input that CFOs, CEOs, heads of M&A, etc., providing to boards to help them make big decisions around an M&A transaction or a fundraising transaction. And you're sort of brought in as a sort of matador type character, which perhaps leads to the hubris. It's those pink tights. And you're there just to provide advice to a group of people that you don't really know. You probably know the chairman, and you certainly know the executive team well. And your kind of read of the board is a sort of slightly unusual one. I suppose my most unusual one ever was advising Texas utilities, where kind of doing that all sort of on the telephone in Dallas, while I was in Dallas with the executive team and the board all around the US. But normal British boards, I think that was my initial experience. It's that sort of kind of high tension, small bit part moment that was kind of my experience really all the way, I think, through until started Greencoat. And then probably during my time in the shadow executive, I had started to see how boards were operating and in a bit more detail and all the things that they were doing, but wasn't actually sitting on one, but very involved with the British Nuclear Fuels Board as that was being disassembled. And similarly, the Urenco board, one step away from it, I wasn't on it then. And the British Energy Board, again, we were 35% shareholders as the government, but we're not on the board, but interacted with what the board was doing and saw all the board papers. And I guess then moving to almost from the sublime to ridiculous, when as a sort of small investor in small companies with a 200 million fund and a 5 million investment in something, trying to assemble the board that would effectively take the entrepreneur to where they needed to get to stop being an entrepreneur in a pure sense, but being an entrepreneur plus business manager over that journey was a fascinating experience, and getting good non-executive chairman in particular really to drive that was hugely important. And I've just used that word and I've said chairmen. And I think really my experience to the point of actually relatively recently where we have a chair, Shona Gemma Page on Greencoat UK Wind, has been that it's been a very male occupied area of the world. And then I guess more recently, then as a director of Urenco for 10 years, 12 years on effectively what's a big joint venture. So it's a slightly clunky board. Doesn't operate in the way that a usual board works. And you're more like there as a shareholder representative rather than as a member of a sort of one team board, but you're trying to create both. And then obviously we have the boards of Greencoat UK Wind and the boards of Greencoat Renewables, both individual independent PLCs with strong non-executive boards, essentially being good clients to us. And I think we do a better job if you have a strong board that's basically overseeing the work that we provide towards them. So there's been an evolution, I guess, around that tiny little moment, that glimpse you see of what a board does, through to now seeing board really working properly.
One of the things that's been fascinating for me to sort of see more time I spent with boards is how many of them are sort of dysfunctional, don't seem to sort of add value in the way that they should. There was an amazing survey done recently which said something like 49% of boards think that at least one of their board members should be replaced and are sort of not fit for purpose, which is just an extraordinary statistic. What sort of value are you looking for from your boards? Can you give us some examples of how they have added value for the organizations that they're serving?
I think on Urenco, the defining moment was, well, there were probably two actually. So one was the board, by the time I had joined, had decided to embark upon expansion into the US on their first new nuclear plant to be built in the US for a generation, and effectively had started the process of building these plants, truthfully, before they'd finished agreeing what type of plant they were going to build. And that led to very substantial cost overruns. And seeing the board sort of managing the situation that we were in, recognizing it was not a good place to be. That then rapidly followed on, or was still probably going on, as Fukushima happened. And the thing that was then probably the most interesting was that I think there was a reasonable number of us around the board table who were pretty clear that something very fundamental had changed in the nuclear world. And I think also there was that noise of the approaching renewables hegemony that we see today. I'm still strongly pro-nuclear, and I'm sure nuclear has a future. I just think that its future is much less secure than it probably would have been 10 years ago. And getting the management team to the point where they were ready to accept as sort of facts rather than wild conjecture those points was a really key piece. And I think in that case, we had a board where, it wasn't the best functioning board, and the respective chairs did an extraordinarily good job of getting the response that ultimately was needed. So, and I think that probably has happened. So that in Urenco kind of really huge changes. I think in the listed funds, I don't manage either of the listed funds. My colleagues do, but there it's very clear that there are the different boards, but they are successful in terms of helping the managers identify the things that really are important, that they help identify the areas where shareholders may cause kind of concerns. And I guess it's sort of doing it in a way that allows the executive team, who, let's be clear, executive teams are what run companies, to deliver their best in a way that lets the board in to help the executives be their best.
And you mentioned the chair having done sort of good jobs there. Were there things that stood out for you in the way that they went about that? I'm always fascinated to understand the sort of tools and techniques of good chairs. What do you think were the frameworks that they used without breaking any confidences?
You've been involved in private investing, and I guess one of the questions I'd ask yourself is, are the kind of folks who kind of undertake it, generally speaking, those kind of unopinionated, et cetera, et cetera. I think the key thing is for the board to deal with us, the manager, actually, is the skill, and doing that in a way that's intelligent and thoughtful, because you're getting, I hope, a good service from us, and one that we're really caring about and behind. But it's then making sure that you as the board get that service delivered in the way that you want it, and how that's brought about through really subtle use. Shona is a fantastically subtle person. She's very clear what she thinks she wants to get done, and then she goes about thinking about the steps she needs to take to make it happen. And I think that's kind of leading her board without getting out in front of them, kind of as far as I see as I'm an observer rather than a participant. And I don't attend the board meetings, but it seems to us has led to some pretty good results for the company over the years. And we've moved from being 260 million to now we're on sort of 3.7 billion. I think we're on the sort of cusp of the FTSE. So quite a change that she and others have overseen.
Fantastic. I'd love to move on to touched on sort of the renewable space already. For those who are not deeply versed in the space as you are, what do you think are the key issues that board members not in the sector need to be thinking about?
Historically, the key issue was really around there were probably two or three key issues. So one was that all renewables were subsidized. So they were sort of first of a kind subsidization of renewables to enable enough renewables to get built for them to compete with the incumbent technologies. And we've passed that point. So that's a huge point that people need to be really thoughtful about for a long period of time. That's not to say that the assets that were built during that period will continue to receive subsidies out until 2037, because they cost much more than they would do now to get built, and therefore it's obvious that happens. So managing that interface and being aware of the sort of the role of the subsidy in the sort of scheme of things was important. I think that the other big area, obviously, is safety. So we operate across Greencoat's multiple funds, over 250 assets. I say we operate. The independent boards of each of the SPVs will contract out with competent third parties the operation of those. But we as a contractor need to be, or person contracting with the third parties, need to be confident and competent to be confident that they will run them safely. We're not responsible for it, but it absolutely is a vital thing for us as Greencoat. And then I guess the final thing was that the investment proposition of these funds is to be a kind of low risk, low return, dependable, predictable, secure income, capital preservation type of story. And I think that all the steps that got taken by any of our listed funds and or our private funds now account for about half of the AUM we have under management. It's to very much deliver what it says on the tin. We don't want to surprise investors in any way, shape or form. And indeed, that's kind of one of the things I've learned the most actually in the last year or so. It's that people haven't really actually wanted to speak to us, our clients, so much because they've been having problems and issues in all their other investments, but renewable investments have done exceptionally well throughout the pandemic. And then obviously they're benefiting from high power prices at the moment. I think today the issue is going to be sort of maneuvering through the obligations and rights essentially that attach to the type of regulatory regime that we have today, and looking at the obvious kind of huge issues that very high power prices cause and very high gas prices cause, and it's gas that's the biggest issue. And gas prices in the context of heating bills are going to be huge issues, social issues for us this year. And so the cost of the energy that this country will need is now starting to, whereas historically it's sort of been, 20, 30 billion, that kind of order of magnitude. That compares with a defence budget of 35 billion. These are enormous numbers. We're talking about hundreds of billions this year. And that I think is going to produce a series of issues and for government and for the boards of the companies that own the assets that are going to be pretty significant to deal with.
What do we need to be doing about this? I mean, is this just a question of further investment and is going to be required, or is there more board members can be doing to plan and mitigate against the impacts?
Alistair Phipps-Davis has made an interesting contribution to this debate, where he's really said that by the time we get to 2030, 2035, we're going to be looking at a low carbon, low cost energy system that has been basically derived from mostly renewables, but with probably a small amount of nuclear. He didn't say nuclear, but I would say nuclear. And so 2030, 2035 is a kind of sunny uplands that we can all see. And I think there's no discussion, there's no doubt, there's no questions that there's that combination of climate and affordability and energy security all come together and we'll be fine. The issue is that for the next few years, we don't have enough renewables to do that job the way it should be done. Our houses are not insulated well enough to allow us to use smaller amounts of gas than we would otherwise have used. And that it's therefore going to lead to a periods of intense discomfort for the next little while. And what essentially needs to happen is that, you look at the point where nearly 50% of the British population is going to find that the cost of energy is more than 15% of their disposable income. This is starting to get to be, a huge issue, a huge social issue. And therefore, I think that the energy utilities have suggested really two things. I think one is a large set of interventions by the government this winter, effectively to cap the cost of energy by essentially creating a pot, a little bit like the Spanish tariff deficit pots, but it's tariff deficit pot, which customers repay over the next 10, 15 years. And that, I think, definitely gets you through this winter. And the amount of the government intervention is going to be kind of way beyond, I think, anything anyone had previously thought would be necessary. But that is not the long-term solution. The long-term solution is to build more renewables, but that will take time. And I guess then the question will be does the government continue to run the tariff deficit model for the next few years, and or could we move to a form of energy reform that bifurcates the market? And I think that utilities are essentially saying that they are ready to have energy reform and that they're looking forward to energy reform, but energy reform needs to be done in a way that balances the rights that different types of players in the market have.
So is your perspective that the inflationary pressures that we're seeing at the moment are short to medium-ish term, and then once you get over that hump, we'll be back to a normal environment in terms of energy inflationary pressures, if not potentially even deflationary?
Yes, I think everything's really in the definitions of short and medium term. So back on 2030. So the Committee on Climate Change, which I think is one of the best institutions we have in this country, has been very clear that it thinks that by the early 2030s, we need to decarbonize the electricity sector. And decarbonizing the electricity sector means that instead of, let's say, making electricity from burning coal, which for every kilowatt hour of electricity you get from coal, you get 1 kilogram of CO2 emitted into the atmosphere, that we move from that to less than 50 grams, i.e. 20-fold reduction in the amount of emissions across the system by the early 2030s. And so if you're sort of down at around 50 grams, we then have the capability to then decarbonize transport, and we have the ability to decarbonize heating using electricity. Those are the sunny uplands that Alistair Phillips-Davies has mentioned in his article in the FT. I think that the path to get there, given that we're only about halfway there, is the bit where we're having the intense time now. And so the forward curve for gas is pretty high for really quite a long way out and doesn't return down to sort of post or pre-pandemic or pre-current crisis levels until 25, 26. So therefore, we have a period now where there's really very high electricity prices, but actually it's not just this winter, it's going to be next winter as well, and high gas prices. The key thing really is to advance as quickly as possible the advent of the renewables. And the government obviously has talked about sort of their 2030 targets, but really moving it in an almost sort of wartime type of approach is kind of going to be what's necessary. And if you look in Germany, if you're in Düsseldorf at the moment, you're being encouraged to use less gas. You're seeing that there are no lights on public buildings at night, et cetera, et cetera. And they really are heading into a situation where they worry that this winter they may not have enough gas. I don't think we will not have enough gas. I think we may not have enough money to afford the gas that we want to have. So we need to get as quickly as we possibly can there. Now, we're not going to get there quickly enough by building renewables. They just take too long to get planned, to get built, to get deployed, etc. And therefore, the way in which the government intervenes in the market will be absolutely key for effectively affordability. And clearly, one talks initially about customers being, people, as in residential customers, but obviously small businesses also are going to suffer similarly.
So if you're sitting on the board of an organisation with a reasonably significant energy spend, which isn't currently hedged, what are the things you'd be sort of thinking about doing now? Should you be just continuing to sort of roll, or should you be trying to lock things in?
I don't think there's an answer to that question, because obviously it totally depends on the market that you're in. But
Sure.
If you're sitting there in a place where somebody else can get the access to the energy they need at a price that's completely different to the price that you've got access to the energy that you need, then you're going to see large market share move to those participants with the lower cost of energy. I think that's something that we're going to see over the medium term anyway. If you're finding that making electricity in Texas is going to be a lot cheaper than making electricity in the UK, you will see that industries that would have been in the UK are now going to happen in Texas, because they've got masses of sun and lots of wind. And I think that in the short term, you will see that glass bottles that get made in the UK may not get made in the UK this year. They'll get made somewhere where there's lower cost of energy. Now, clearly, supply chains and all those other things have been sort of optimized for a decade of globalization that we've seen. And then clearly, you can't go and put up a glass bottle making factory wherever immediately. I think it will lead, in my mind, to some reduction in economic output. Is almost certainly what will happen. People will have to shut for periods. And I think obviously that's, even if you don't go towards actual rationing of molecules, it'll be rationing through pricing for businesses that we will start to see this year. My wife's a farmer, so those cattle that you mentioned in the introduction are really hers, not mine. So she's looking at building a barn. A barn this year costs 3 times as much as it would have cost if we bought it last year. If we could wait another 2 years, it's forecast to come right back down again. So therefore, you just will see less activity, I think, in barn manufacturing than you have done over the years. And that's obviously bad news if you're a barn manufacturer. So each business will be different, I think, but people with a large energy component of their bill, I'm afraid, I think are going to have a very difficult couple of years.
So you see both a timing effect, but also there's a sort of political shift that you can see happening here as low-cost centres basically reorient towards those with the renewable resource.
Yes, because the renewable resource will be much cheaper than anything else, and also it's securer as well. You can have it when the wind blows and the sun shines. And that sort of issue around intermittency, that sort of the folks on Twitter who seem determined to continue to be stupid or ill-informed kind of keep mentioning, oh gosh, but it's intermittent. Yes, we know that. I think there will be solutions for that, which will be much cheaper than the alternatives of continuing to burn fossil, regardless of whether or not there's a climate discussion to have or not. And I think that is completely true. So Minford has often been disparaged on Twitter. Twitter obviously seems to be the main role to disparage people. But he was very clear that some industries will have to move. Yes, he was talking about Brexit. I think that actually the world order of what happens where will change because of energy. And if energy becomes a bigger and bigger piece or component of, and people have materially lower energy prices in some parts of the world, then you'll see it moving. You've already seen that happening in aluminium smelting, but we, for instance, have 3 large greenhouses that we have being built in the moment in East Anglia. 2 of them are actually up and running, and the 2 that are up and running get their energy from the sewage outflow pipes of the Norwich sewage treatment works and the Bury St Edmunds sewage treatment works. And don't worry, there's no sewage going on to any of your tomatoes. There's a heat exchanger in that outflow pipe. And that cold 13 degrees water or lukewarm 13 degrees water is pumped round to the greenhouses where there's some of the largest heat pumps in Europe. And we then use that to basically heat the greenhouse to the temperature they need to grow at to grow tomatoes. And the tomatoes in those greenhouses are 75% lower carbon footprint than any other tomato grown in a comparable way. Most tomatoes are grown in Northern Europe in greenhouses using gas-fired heating. That's a very expensive way these days to grow tomatoes. So you'll see essentially businesses moving depending on what the cost of energy is. Now that's a medium-term effect, but it'll be very profound. And you'll see, we've always envisaged, I think, towards the end of the transition, that more complicated substitutions. It's quite easy to substitute electricity. You put a wind farm, a solar farm, batteries, backup, etc. I think there are a lot of processes that involve use of coal or reduction of some description that will ultimately require hydrogen, which will be quite expensive. And those almost certainly will move to where the hydrogen's made, because transporting hydrogen currently is the most expensive part of the chain. And I think we're seeing this move from, everyone talks about renewables as wind and solar farms, but actually in the future, a third of the output from renewables will be used to make hydrogen, I think most people believe. And that hydrogen then is used to do that last little bit of decarbonisation.
That brings us nicely onto the whole sort of topic of ESG, which clearly plays a huge role at Greencoat. And you've sort of been very passionate and public in the way that you've sort of gone about that. I'd love to hear more about how you've gone about embedding that in the organization as you've grown. I think you highlight 6 areas of focus that are particularly relevant for you around workplace health and safety, reducing carbon emissions and producing renewable energy, cybersecurity, workplace health and safety, robust governance and compliance, and engaging with local communities. But what have been the key gotchas, or sort of the learnings that you've had from that other board members now thinking about their own ESG strategies might be able to benefit from?
I guess I'm almost the worst person to ask about this, because we started off sort of with these sort of things, frankly, as givens for our business operating model. So our main pitch when we went to see investors was these are great investments from a financial point of view, and they have good income characteristics, and your capital is preserved and there's low risk. And we've spent 14 years doing that. And whilst we've been doing that, the things that we were doing anyway, like we're a premium listed company on the UK Stock Exchange with our biggest fund. We're AIM listed in Ireland on our listed fund. But we then have, very large amounts of money for very large pension funds with millions of people relying on us doing what we're doing. So, having good governance has had to happen. And then health and safety comes from the governance actually of the individual SPVs. As we've talked about earlier, health and safety is just not something you can compromise on. How we interact with the local community, that's just a given. You don't get to build a large wind farm or a big solar farm if the community is to a man, woman and child against what you're doing. So these things have been things that have really been part of what we have done, truthfully, since the beginning. Now, do we measure them more than we used to? Definitely. Do we think about how we can talk about them more than we used to? Yes. Do our clients ask us to help them understand the sort of information that we're providing to them, and think of a way of really quantifying a series of what otherwise becomes sort of anecdotal? Yes, to all of those things. And I think that's the interesting sort of piece of where we're going. So I don't think we can yet tell you that all of our funds are, Article 9 SFDR compliant, but we're pretty close if we're not there on them already. So those are all good things. I think that truthfully, that everybody else is kind of catching up. That sounds a bit arrogant, but it wasn't a deliberate policy. I didn't go, let's start this business with the best ESG characteristics. Well, I didn't know what ESG was, but it was just, they were givens in the type of business that we were in, rather than the things that we've had to think, how do we pollute less or whatever it is. Do we have some pollution? Yes, we do. We have power stations which emit sulfur dioxide, and every now and again we breach the permit. And we try really hard not to, and we focus on that a lot. On health and safety, we hope near misses only, and very occasionally we have some form of an accident. Do we manage that, monitor that? All of them, definitely. So these are all things around about, I think, sort of creating more of a structure around stuff that we kind of knew was obvious, I think. I hope that's sort of not sounding arrogant. It's not at all meant to. We weren't the smart kids on the block who sort of thought, there's this massive wave coming, it's called ESG, let's get in there. It just was very lucky. And I think it slightly comes back to my story at the beginning about getting hired. You just sometimes have to be lucky. And if the person hadn't arrived in with the note to say that the person interviewing me was needed, I might never have got my job at Morgan Grenfell, and we wouldn't be talking today.
There's been a lot of talk about greenwashing and organizations who are greenwashing, and it strikes me that the whole certification and sort of proof of organizations' green credentials is actually much more complex than certainly I had ever initially sort of anticipated. And talking to someone recently about various case studies that they as an investor faced, where they had an investment opportunity in an organization that had some solar panels, where on due diligence they figured out that there was some sort of connection to child labor, that the solar panels were already made though, manufactured, and it was unproven whether child labor had been involved with the manufacturer. And so they had this sort of dilemma of, could they invest in this company using those solar panels, because it would be a waste to just let them go. But equally, it was tainted by this sort of allegation. What's been your experience of sort of navigating that balance between sort of greenwashing, but also sort of credibility around credentials?
It's a really good point. So I think they're sort of two slightly different points. So on the solar panels and Uyghurs, and I think it really is Uyghurs in China, that we should mostly be concerned about, so slave labor, that it's pretty clear that there are issues. So it's pretty clear that we should all be trying as an industry to do something to say we're not going to buy panels from places where there are issues that we aren't getting the right answers to. And the solar industry is kind of coming together to make sure that that does happen. Did we focus on that as much as we should have done, we and the rest of the industry? No. It's pretty clear that, if you look at most of the UK solar park has been built pre-2017, so probably pre-significant involvement of slaves over the then period. But that doesn't excuse, one needs to. I think that we feel that it's a little bit like the position of the RSPB on wind farms. Yes, wind farms do from time to time kill birds, but it's the alternative that nothing will survive if it gets very hot because we don't take the right steps to do climate change. Therefore, wind farms that are in the right place are wind farms that they should support. And I think it's different but similar on the issue of slave labour. Now, we have found it immensely difficult, Truth, I think the whole industry, to really get to good answers to the questions that we want to know the answers to out of sun panels coming out of China over the last few years. But I think that we see, particularly as sort of China opens up post-pandemic, and don't forget, the Shanghai lockdown's pretty recent, the getting more access and getting the questions answered better, I think, will really come through over the next 12, 18 months. And that there's a lot of focus on that. So having given you a very positive picture on our ESG, and it was all great and we were in a right place, clearly there were the issues like the ones that you raised. I think on the general greenwashing, again, I'm probably not the best place to do this. I think that it's difficult, just from this a personal point of view, to think that people who are doing immense damage to the environment, like the oil and gas companies, through doing what they do and selling it to people who then use it for the purpose that it was designed for, i.e. burning, are doing immense damage. I think that we have to accept that that is just where society is now, and the key thing then is the moving with those companies. I do think that there's a point at which, if you've got 20 billion a year and for the last 5 or 6 years you've been of capital expenditure spending no more than $1 billion a year, then saying you're really strongly on the journey and putting adverts out on Twitter and social media in general is probably pulling oil by the legs a little bit. But that's not to say that they shouldn't and aren't a key part of the move. And, others, not me, will hold them accountable to that journey. The tricky piece in my mind actually is that buying a coal mine, today, if it's on 3 times free cash flow, it only has to work for 4 or 5 years and you're in the money. These are quite difficult issues, I think, and you're seeing sort of investors in companies that are taking steps to clean themselves up. The join needs to be that those are the successful companies rather than the ones that aren't. And even if the coal mine is only successful for 5, 6 years, it's still potentially a great investment. And so therefore making these screens around that, I think, is difficult. Now, I'm way over my skis, and one of the things about joining Schroders has been fantastic has been actually starting to talk to the teams there that do the work on the wider, more diversified market. They have their own tool, SustainX, which they use for screening. And clearly, others will have different tools, but it's then that how those tools are put to work to make the investment decisions that seems to me is the unanswered bit for many. In terms of the sort of greenwashing, I think it's clear, wasn't it, that green bonds originally got issued where people could make their own claims as long as they published what they were doing, then other people could make their minds up. As far as I can see, the evidence suggests that there isn't really a very big credit spread between a green bond issued by somebody and a non-green bond issued by somebody, and or companies that are heading towards being greener and their credit rating of comparable financials and one that isn't. That again, that sort of price differentiation hasn't truthfully opened up enough to allow the sort of it's obvious, isn't it, to sort of come through. Now, do I think that will be stranded assets? Yes. Do I think all sorts of things that could emerge? Yes. But if you look at oil and gas companies, nearly all of them have an 8 to 10 year weighted average reserve life. We're going to be using oil and gas for the next 8 to 10 years, no problem, probably for the next 30 years. So therefore, I don't think that Shell or BP or others are going to get stranded in what they have today. But the key is for them to move to do what we need to do. And obviously you're seeing some signs of that. And, BP obviously in Looney, what he's doing, but I think also that what Total is doing is also interesting. I don't think it's greenwashing. I think that they're probably making more out of what they're actually doing today than they could. But I think that the direction is starting to change. And particularly if you look at, say, for instance, BP and what they're going to do in ammonia and the size of those investments that they say they're going to start making, that really will be differentiating. And it's pretty exciting to see what they and others are looking to do there.
I would just want to touch on one last topic there around your sort of diversity and inclusion. You've done a lot of work on that front. You've got this CSR forum. I'd love to hear more about the impact that has had on the business.
So I guess we're starting from a point where the fact is that Greencoat was owned by 4 middle-aged white guys, basically. And so, on the face of it, we're not incredibly diverse. I think if you spoke to my partners, you'd say, we have a French engineer, we have two gentlemen from Yorkshire, and God, did we know that during the Olympics that they came from Yorkshire. And occasionally they'd be known to mention it at other times. But we kind of have tried to focus on making Greencoat a place where we don't all go in and the hippo wins, the highest paid person's opinion. We try to make Greencoat a place where we do listen to people and what they say. And that means not having everybody looking the same on the team. So you need offense, defense, a kicker, a quarterback, etc. And that those people all have their own role that needs to then be heard. And I think that's the starting point for what we're trying to do. And so, for instance, we have probably a third of our businesses are engineers who actually, their job is to oversee the safe and reliable operation of the actual physical assets that we have by other people. Those people do something completely different to what the investment team does or what the accountants do. And so therefore you need to take note of that. You need to rejoice in the fact that they have a different point of view, because that's why we've hired them. So I guess that's kind of the start. On the sort of CSR side, I think we felt that when you see internships, it's forever the internships were going to somebody's child, friend, relation, client's child, friend, relation, etc. So we've taken some quite large steps over the last few years to try hard to change that. So we tracked people in different stages. And the thing that we've probably the most happy about what we've done is, which involves probably somewhere between a half and 2/3 of the group, is that every year we have had 8 to 10 folks from basically tough places that aren't the kind of places that it's easy just to whiz around to Greencoat and stay in your relations flat in Fulham and all the rest of it. And this is for people who are in the middle of their A-level year. And so we've now been running that for 3 years, I think. And the best thing is that we're going to take back someone who's doing his university sort of sandwich pieces at Loughborough, who wants to come to us for 6 to 12 months, who wasn't thinking of going to university before he came on our course. And I guess that we found that what it does for the people at Greencoat is fantastic. And that's kind of why we sort of started doing it. It was also saying what we could do for kind of a wider group. And it's not a sort of simple trade-offs. We've tried hard to go and find people from sort of, far away places. I think quite often that sort of, there are poor people in the north, there are people who need this sort of leg up, et cetera, et cetera. Simplicity is just, not there. So we've been really happy with that. And we run that college in Lowestoft has been probably our biggest supplier of students. And then one in Roscommon in the middle bit of Ireland, which is probably not the most cosmopolitan bit of Ireland. Roscommon's a great place, but probably not. So that we've very much done. And from that, then we've built on it. And Schroders has helped, I think, in that regard as well. Schroders has one of the reasons we picked Schroders was the sort of the culture that we saw at Schroders. And Schroders actually have sent us over an accountant to help run our finances. And the second person that they sent us was an HR person. We hadn't got as many as we needed. And the third person they've sent us is a cultural person. And so she comes and sits in our team most weeks. And we're trying to develop what we've already started, but with a slightly more sophisticated approach, I think. So next year, I hope we're going to be Dawid Konotioglu came to see me last week, and he's very enthusiastic that we should try to take some T-level students. I didn't really know about T-levels, but I know there are 1,000 people who haven't yet got their results, it seems. And so we're going to do that. And also not just his 10,000 black intern opportunity, but also perhaps we might try to get people who are going to struggle to actually sort of physically get into the office. So kind of how can we approach that? And so we're in early days of discussing that. So nothing kind of really groundbreaking. I think that we can sit there and go, the world should come to see what Greencoat's doing. I'm sorry we haven't done that. But I think that we're really pleased with the steps we've taken and some of the successes, this little success, having a person who wouldn't have gone to university is coming back now, having gone to university to then do his gap year with us. It was just one of the best moments of my holiday last week.
God, I love that. Richard, I could keep talking to you and asking you questions all day. Unfortunately, you've got to that time where it's time for a 5-question quickfire where I say a statement and you give a short response, if that sounds all right.
Off we go.
Fantastic. So first up is the best book that every board member should read and why.
I've really struggled on this, but I think it's a one clear winner. So it's Caroline Criado Perez's book, Invisible Women. And I don't think it's just to do with your role as a board member. I think it's to do with your role as a human. I couldn't believe what she was writing about. And for those of you who haven't read her book, it's called Invisible Women, and it's essentially on sex. It's developing sex disaggregated data. And so I had no idea that nearly all medicines are only tested on men. No car crash dummy has ever been formulated to be a woman. before. The EU doesn't insist on it. The Americans don't. Nobody does. And therefore, if you're a woman involved in a car crash, you have a materially higher chance of being injured than a man involved in a car crash. And I'm thinking, God, this is just wow. And she goes through example after example after example. And I just sort of think how fantastic my wife has been not to just beat me more than occasionally deserve to be on these points. So that for me was my kind of big book, I think probably the last few years, Invisible Women.
Amazing. Thank you. Your favourite quote and why?
There is a guy who sadly has now died, Sir David Mackay, who is a sort of polymath scientist at Cambridge, who England was lucky enough, or the UK was lucky enough to get him to be the chief scientist at DEC for a while. And David wrote a book called Sustainability Without the Hot Air, probably late last decade before last, so 2008, that kind of order of magnitude. He has two great lines. I think the first one is if we all do a little, we'll achieve a little. And I think that's such an important point, which is that it's all very well not charging your phone or whatever it is, and et cetera, et cetera. But actually, it's the big steps that we all have to take. And those of us who are in a position to take big steps, who can contribute to the sort of challenges that we have, it's no good just switching your TV off at night rather than having it on standby. I mean, it's just not good enough. We need to do more. And so I'm a big believer in that phrase. I think I probably slightly misquoted him. And then the other one is that he's talking about nuclear, and he says that he's neither for nor against, but he is pro-arithmetic. And I guess to me, that's another absolutely key piece, which is that it's all very well having a point of view on something, but if the members just don't back you up, then you're probably on pretty thin ice, shaky ground, whatever the right analogy is. And those two both occur in this fantastic book. And again, it's a little bit out of date, and obviously the thing that he hadn't understood, I think, then, which has happened now, is that the cost of renewables have just gone down out of all proportion, that £400 to £30-40, the 99% reduction in the cost of making a solar panel. It's brilliant stuff. So those two.
Love that. Your best ever holiday and why?
I have a 23-year-old and a 20-year-old, and I think probably we took a view that probably about 5-6 years ago, I'm not quite sure when, that they were just going to leave home. And this was pre-pandemic. And we all went to Namibia and we rented a bright red Jeep, which was a little bit gaudy. But my children got to pick the music that we listened to all the way around. And Namibia is a fantastic country where it's big and it's much less sort of intense, I think, than many other countries in that part of the world. And I think that we all kind of got to have to live with each other in a way that was just different to how we'd ever done it before, sort of a normal holiday that we'd ever been on. So often we'd go to Scotland or something to the same place each time, or we'd go skiing to the same place each time, or this was just different. And I think that we'd all taken sort of memories from that will certainly be with us forever. And I think it's also led us to realize that actually there's some importance in doing it. And what now frightens me is that neither of my children came on holiday with me and my wife this year, is that, whether there's some kind of logarithmic relationship between the cost of the holiday and their desire to come on it with you or not. So as they get older, you've got to do more. Until I suspect they have children and maybe we'll be babysitting or something like that. I don't know. And they'll want to come to wherever we want to go on holiday. But Namibia, I think, with driving around in that slightly vulgar red Jeep was pretty good.
Sounds fantastic. And your significant professional insight?
I think it's very obvious that you need to be really lucky. And I keep coming back to my initial story, but it's clear that if you kind of are in the right place and you're working hard at the issue, then the luck emerges and you can take advantage of that luck. And if you're in the wrong place, and I think it's a societal comment as well, kind of clearly it's more difficult to have luck. And so those of us who have privileges, kind of that luck comes through more obviously. But I think you shouldn't underestimate that really trying hard leads to that sort of breakthrough, those sort of moments when you make a big step forward. For my sins, I have a geology degree because I wasn't good enough at maths to do a sensible subject when I was at university, and I didn't think I'd get into Oxford otherwise. And one of the things you spend a lot of time on is evolution, and that sort of step around evolution, which is, that evolution, things tend to carry on being much the same for quite a long while, and then there's a big leap forward, and then you find the old thing dies out, and the new species, as it were, has occupied the niche that the old species was occupying, but just doing it better. And I sort of think that's the same in business as well. So, and it's that sort of lucky bit as well. Yes, there is. Evolution isn't that the bird wanted to develop a different colored shaped beak. It's that it randomly did. And that was the one that survived. Now, I think it's slightly different in business in that we're trying to make the randomness less random. But then occasionally you just get that big jump forward and you're in a better place than anyone else and you can kind of turn the handle a bit and make a big step forward.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love that. And last but not least, your favorite app?
So I was wondering about this. I mean, it's obvious it's Twitter because I am an absolute Twitterholic, and I spent my life sort of looking at angry people saying things in what used to be 147 characters. But I was sort of wondering, could I come up with a sort of more worthy one? So my son's a type 1, and there's a fantastic app that allows me to see what his blood sugar level is at all time globally. But he switched me off from that because he doesn't want me to interfere with his blood sugar level. So therefore, I have the app, but it's absolutely useless because it requires him to have it turned on to allow me to access it. So I'm going to stick with Twitter. The only thing I think also, just last word on Twitter is that in the old days, it used to obviously be the 147, but the thing that's fantastic is the attachment that comes with it, and that you're having interesting things curated for you by people you think are interesting. If you don't think they're interesting, don't follow them. But if you do think they're interesting, then look at that attachment. And it's a little bit like when I was at school, my parents would write to me regularly, and my mother would write, and it would be, dogs are well, your father's impossible, kind of love mummy. And literally, if I read the entire term's letters, they're all the same, pretty much. Whereas my grandmother would write to me on her sort of airmail envelope. She lived abroad, and she would enclose a bit of sort of an airmail cutting from the Telegraph that she thought a 9-year-old boy would find interesting. And she was effectively an early Twitter person, because I'd have a small letter and in it would be a cutting from the paper which would be interesting to a 9-year-old boy, and it would be on a fritillary. So Twitter for me is that same thing. It's that enjoying the, you should read this and you will leave less ignorant than you went in. And there's a lot of rubbish written on Twitter, and there's just a lot of opinions and, yah, ha, yah, boo, etc. But that bit when you get an interesting attachment and it takes you off, 15 minutes or 10 minutes to read it and then a day or a week to think about it, that's why I find it so interesting.
Richard, that's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. It's always such a privilege to talk with entrepreneurs, and particularly someone who is doing something that has such a positive social impact and has been so successful doing it is really fantastic. So thank you so much for your time.